In the final weeks of August, 1997, high in the mountain village of Hollow Pine, tucked deep in the folded ridges of the northern Cascades, most families were doing the sensible work of late summer. They were splitting cord wood for the long winter, patching cedar shingles before the first hard freeze, checking their pantries for salt and flour, and marking the paths their children would take to school once the drifts arrived. But Dorothy Ellsworth, 63 years old and stubborn as the granite beneath her feet, was doing something else entirely. She was digging. Every morning before the first bell rang at St. Anselm's Chapel, Dorothy walked the narrow footpath behind her weathered clapboard house carrying a kerosene lantern, a short-handled shovel, and a folded canvas satchel of iron brackets. She would disappear through the slanted cellar doors behind her kitchen, and she would not come out again until the mountain shadows crossed the ridge above the village. Inside that cellar, hidden from the world, she was extending a network of tunnels that no one in Hollow Pine fully understood. She shored the walls with peeled fir timbers cut from her own back lot. She braced the ceilings with crossbeams thick enough to hold a wagon. She stocked shelves with jars of preserves, sacks of flour sealed in tin, coils of rope, tallow candles, kerosene, blankets pressed tight into oilcloth bundles, and boxes of matches wrapped in wax paper. To an outsider, it might have looked like the work of a survivalist expecting the end of the world. To the villagers, who had watched her do this every summer for as long as most of them could remember, it was simply Dorothy's affliction. Children called her cellar the Mole's Palace. Old men at the general store shook their heads whenever her name came up. Women at the Sunday market lowered their voices when she walked past. "She's burying herself early," they whispered. Poor thing never came back up from that slide in '58. Nobody said it unkindly, exactly, but nobody said it warmly either. Dorothy had heard every version of the whispering for nearly 40 years, and she had never once bothered to answer. She only nodded politely, paid for her flour with quiet coins, and returned to her digging. What none of them knew, and what she had never told a living soul, was that her tunnels no longer ran only beneath her own property. One of them, patiently extended a few feet each summer for 11 straight years, was reaching somewhere else entirely. A place carefully chosen. A place she had measured with a compass and a length of knotted twine long before the first shovel ever broke ground. And the direction it was heading, if anyone had bothered to look at the compass rose, she kept pinned to her cellar wall, pointed straight toward the heart of the village. Would her strange, decades-long obsession turn out to be the ravings of a woman broken by grief? Or was Dorothy Ellsworth, in her quiet and unhurried way, preparing for something the rest of the village could not yet see coming? Before this story is over, an entire community will owe her a debt they can never repay, and one family in particular will discover that the woman they pitied had been carrying their name in her heart for 50 years. Subscribe now, because what happened in Hollow Pine that winter is a story the mountain has never truly let go of. To understand Dorothy Ellsworth, you had to understand what happened in the winter of 1958, though she herself almost never spoke of it. She had been 9 years old that February, a small, quiet girl with dark braids and a habit of humming while she worked. Her parents, Thomas and Rosalind Ellsworth, ran a modest boarding house at the eastern edge of Hollow Pine, right where the timber line began climbing toward the shoulder of Silver Ridge. It was a good house, warm and full of the smells of yeast bread and pine smoke, and on the night the slide came down, 7 guests were sleeping under its roof. The snow that year had been strange from the start. Heavy in December, then thin and crusted in January, then piled again by a series of wet Pacific storms that dumped 4 feet in 10 days. On the evening of February 14th, a warm Chinook wind curled down through the passes, softening the upper snowpack while the layer beneath stayed frozen hard as slate. Old miners in the village saw the signs and slept uneasy. Rosalind Ellsworth did not. She tucked her daughter into bed beneath a quilt her own mother had stitched, kissed her forehead, and blew out the lamp. The slide came down at 3:47 in the morning. It took the eastern half of Hollow Pine in less than 40 seconds. The boarding house was gone before the guests could reach the door. The Ellsworth barn, the smokehouse, the woodshed, the small chapel her father had helped build with his own hands, all of it swallowed under a wall of packed snow, splintered pine and shattered rock that came to rest against the schoolhouse foundation half a mile downhill. 9 people died that night. Dorothy, tucked deep beneath her grandmother's quilt in a corner bedroom, survived because a broken roof beam fell across her bed at exactly the right angle, creating a small triangular pocket of air no larger than a steamer trunk. For 4 days, she lay in that pocket. She could not move her legs. She could not see her hands. She counted her breaths because there was nothing else to count. She sang, sometimes, the same 3 hymns her mother had taught her, until her voice gave out and she could only mouth the words. She heard nothing from above, no shouting, no shovels, no dogs. Only the strange, dense silence of buried snow, which is a silence unlike any other silence in the world. On the 4th day, a search party made up entirely of strangers, men who had ridden in on horseback from 3 villages farther down the valley, dug into what remained of the boarding house. They were not from Hollow Pine. They did not know the Ellsworths. They had come simply because word had spread through the mountains that a village needed help, and in those years, in those places, that was reason enough. A man named Elias Broward, a logger from a settlement called Copper Fork, was the one whose shovel finally struck the roof beam above her head. He was the one who pulled her out. She weighed 41 pounds when they weighed her in the doctor's office that afternoon. Dorothy never forgot his face. She never forgot any of their faces. She learned each name the strangers gave her, wrote them down carefully in a small leather book her aunt bought her that spring, and carried that book with her for the rest of her life. She was raised, after that winter, by an aunt in the lower valley town of Bridgemere, a place of orchards and mild seasons where the snow rarely climbed past a man's knee. Her aunt was a kind woman, patient and slow-spoken, and she gave Dorothy everything a grieving child was supposed to need: a warm bed, regular meals, a schoolhouse close enough to walk to, Sunday services at a white-steepled church where the choir sang softly and no one ever mentioned avalanches. For 11 years, Dorothy lived that quiet valley life, and to anyone watching from the outside, she seemed to be healing. But something in her had not healed. Something in her, in fact, had never left that pocket of air beneath the roof beam. She still counted her breaths sometimes when she lay in bed at night. She still felt, in her chest, the strange pressing weight of packed snow overhead, even when the room around her was warm and open and full of lamplight. She read every book she could find about mountain weather, about snowpack, about the slow chemistry of layered ice, and the way a warm rain could turn a peaceful ridge into a loaded gun. She kept a notebook of her own now, filled with sketches of slide paths and terrain angles, and she studied it the way other girls her age studied fashion catalogs from the coast. When she turned 20, she did something no one in her aunt's family understood. She moved back to Hollow Pine. The village had rebuilt itself by then, though it never grew back to what it had been before the slide. A new chapel had risen on higher ground, this one built of quarried stone with walls 3 feet thick, its basement dug deep into the bedrock and designated by the county as the official refuge for the village in any future emergency. A general store had opened where the old smokehouse used to stand. A small schoolhouse taught the children of the 12 families who had returned or been born there since. Dorothy bought a small clapboard house on the western edge of the village, 3 lots away from where her parents' boarding house had once stood, and she moved in with 2 trunks, a shovel, and the leather book of names. The digging began that first summer. It began small. A modest root cellar, the kind any careful mountain woman might dig behind her kitchen to keep potatoes and preserves through the winter. The villagers barely noticed. When she extended it the following summer, adding a second chamber lined with fir timbers, an old carpenter named Holly's Wren offered to help her, and then walked away shaking his head when he saw how deep she meant to go. She dug alone after that. She was slow, methodical, patient in a way that unnerved people who watched her too long. She never rushed. She never took shortcuts. Every timber she set was measured twice. Every joint was pegged, not nailed, because pegs would not rust and rot the way iron nails would over the long decades she planned to leave them in the earth. By her 30th birthday, her cellar had 3 chambers. By her 40th, it had 5, and a narrow gallery running 80 feet east beneath the village lane. By her 50th, the tunnels reached nearly to the churchyard fence. And still, she said nothing. She simply kept the leather book of names on her kitchen shelf, and every night before she slept, she read one of them aloud into the quiet room. The village learned to live around her strangeness, the way mountain villages always learn to live around the peculiar habits of their neighbors. In Hollow Pine, everyone had a small oddness of some kind. Old Holly's wren talked to the crows that nested behind his workshop. The Delacroix sisters, twin spinsters who ran the general store, refused to sell tobacco on any day that ended in the number 3. Reverend Marsh, the young pastor who had come up from Seattle in 1989 to lead St. Anselm's, kept a pet raccoon named Barnaby that rode on his shoulder during summer sermons. Compared to these gentle eccentricities, Dorothy Ellsworth and her endless digging was simply another feature of village life, no stranger than the mist that rose off the creek at dawn. Still, the children could not help themselves. They were children, and children are drawn to mysteries the way moths are drawn to lamps. In the long afternoons of summer, small groups of them would gather at the fence line behind Dorothy's house and try to peer through the slanted cellar doors whenever she propped them open for air. They dared each other to knock. They invented stories about what she kept down there. One boy, a freckled 10-year-old named Peter Halloran, claimed his older sister had once seen Dorothy carrying a human skull wrapped in newspaper. Another child insisted the tunnels connected to an old silver mine, and that Dorothy was digging for lost treasure her father had buried before the slide. A third whispered that she was building her own grave, chamber by chamber, so that, when the mountain finally came for her the way it had come for her parents, she would already be waiting inside it. Dorothy heard the stories. She heard them because mountain villages are small, and small places have thin walls, and thin walls carry every whisper eventually. She never corrected any of them. She only smiled sometimes when a child ran past her yard, and once in a great while she left a jar of blackberry preserves on the fence post for whoever might be brave enough to take it. The jars always disappeared by morning. Reverend Marsh was one of the few adults in Hollow Pine who ever spoke to her about the work directly. He was a soft-eyed man in his late 30s, with a young wife named Clara and a 2-year-old daughter named June, and he had a habit of walking the village lanes in the evenings to check on his parishioners. One autumn twilight in 1994, he stopped at Dorothy's fence while she was hauling a load of fresh cedar timbers from her wagon toward the cellar doors. He watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat gently. "Dorothy," he said, "may I ask you something that isn't any of my business?" She set the timber down and looked at him without answering, which was her way of giving permission. "Do you believe another slide is coming?" he asked. She thought about the question for a long time. The last light of the day was turning the ridge above the village a deep coppery gold, and somewhere down by the creek a thrush was singing its evening song. Finally she said, "Reverend, the mountain is always coming. The only question is whether we are ready when it arrives." Then she picked up her timber and carried it into the cellar, and the Reverend walked home with her words turning slowly in his mind. The 11th year of the church tunnel was the year Dorothy finally broke through. She had been aiming for it since 1986, marking her progress in a small ledger she kept locked in a tin box beneath her kitchen floorboards. The distance from her cellar to the north wall of the St. Anselm's basement was, according to her calculations, 437 feet, running at a gentle downward angle beneath the village lane, beneath the churchyard, and finally beneath the stone foundation itself. She dug perhaps 12 feet a summer, sometimes less, when the ground turned to shale and she had to hammer through it inch by inch with a chisel and a small sledge. Sometimes more, when she struck a soft vein of glacial till and the shovel moved through it like a spoon through pudding. She reached the basement wall on a warm afternoon in July of 1997. She had known she was close for weeks, and she had slowed her work deliberately, wanting to be certain she surfaced at exactly the right spot. She had studied the church basement from the inside for years, attending every rummage sale and choir rehearsal and quilting circle, mapping every wall in her memory. The place she wanted was the northeast corner, behind a heavy oak cabinet where the ladies' auxiliary stored their winter coats and folding chairs. Nobody moved that cabinet. Nobody had moved it in 20 years. If she surfaced behind it, the opening would be invisible from the main basement floor. When her shovel finally struck the outer face of the foundation stone, she stopped and sat down in the tunnel and let herself cry for the first time in nearly 40 years. Not from sadness, from something closer to relief, the kind of relief a person feels when a promise made long ago has finally been kept. She sat in the dark with her lantern beside her and thought about her mother's hands, and about the man named Elias Broward whose shovel had once struck the beam above her head, and about all the strangers whose names she still read every night before sleep. She spent the rest of that summer widening the final chamber and setting the exit stone. The exit stone was a piece of dressed granite she had cut and shaped over 3 winters in her woodshed, sized precisely to match the missing block she intended to remove from the church foundation. She fitted it into place from her side of the wall so that the outer face looked identical to the surrounding masonry. From inside the church basement, no one would ever notice it. From inside her tunnel, a single iron lever, hidden beneath a burlap flap, could tip the stone inward and open a passage large enough for a grown man to crawl through. She never told a soul. Not Reverend Marsh, not Holly's Wren, not the Delacroix sisters, not even the village doctor who had known her since she was a child. She simply sealed the tunnel behind her, walked home through the summer twilight, and made herself a supper of bread and butter and cold chicken. That autumn, the mountain began doing the small, quiet things it always did before a bad winter. The elk moved down from the high meadows earlier than usual. The creek froze over in October, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and an old miner named Cyrus Penn, who lived alone in a cabin above the timber line, came into the general store one morning and told the Delacroix sisters that the snowpack this year was going to break something. Nobody quite knew what he meant. Nobody asked. The snows came early that winter, and they came heavy. By the first week of November, Hollow Pine had already received 42 inches, more than it usually saw by Christmas. The village settled into the familiar rhythms of a hard mountain winter. Wood smoke rose in steady columns from every chimney. Children walked to school along paths shoveled into 6-foot trenches. Reverend Marsh held Sunday services in a chapel warmed by 2 cast-iron stoves, and the congregation stamped snow from their boots at the door before filing in to sing. Clara Marsh, the Reverend's young wife, was pregnant with their second child, and the village women brought her jars of soup and folded stacks of hand-knitted booties throughout the long, cold weeks of December. Dorothy went about her winter the way she always did. She fed her wood stove. She read her books. She kept the tunnels ventilated with a system of small tin chimneys she had designed herself, angled so that snow could not seal them shut. Every morning she walked the length of her galleries with a lantern, checking the timbers for stress, listening to the timbers themselves, because good fir wood will speak before it fails. The tunnels held. They had always held. January was colder than any January in living memory. The thermometer nailed to the wall outside the general store dropped to 28 below zero on the night of the 15th, and stayed there for 6 days. Pipes burst in half the houses in Hollow Pine. The Delacroix sisters kept their store open around the clock, so that anyone whose home lost heat could come sit by the potbelly stove until morning. Reverend Marsh, whose parsonage had a good deep basement furnace, opened his home to 2 families whose roofs had begun sagging under the accumulated snow load. By the end of the month, the total snowpack on the ridges above the village was measured at just over 14 feet. Then, on the 2nd day of February, the wind changed. It came from the southwest, warm and wet and smelling of the ocean, the kind of wind old-timers in the Cascades called a pineapple express. It rolled up the valley slowly at first and then all at once, and by nightfall the temperature in Hollow Pine had climbed 41 degrees in 9 hours. Snow began melting from the eaves. Water dripped from every branch. And then, just before midnight, the rain started. It was not a mountain rain. It was a coastal rain, heavy and sustained, the kind that falls for days without pausing. It fell on 14 feet of loaded snowpack, and it soaked down through the upper layers, and it reached the frozen crust beneath, and it began to do the terrible slow work that warm rain always does on deep snow. It added weight. It broke bonds. It turned solid snowpack into a saturated, unstable mass sitting on a frozen slope at an angle of 38 degrees above a sleeping village. Cyrus Penn, the old miner above the timber line, woke at 2 in the morning of February 3rd to a sound he had heard only once before in his life. It was the sound of a mountain preparing to move. He pulled on his boots and stood on his porch in the pouring rain, and he listened, and he understood exactly what was coming. He had no telephone. He had no way to warn anyone. He simply crossed himself, went back inside, and began to pray. In her cellar 3 miles below him, Dorothy Ellsworth was already awake. She had woken an hour earlier, sitting up in bed with the strange certainty a person feels when a memory reaches out from very far away and touches them on the shoulder. She lit her lamp. She dressed carefully, wool over wool, the way her mother had taught her. She laced her boots. She wrapped a heavy shawl over her shoulders, and she went down into the cellar and began her final preparations. She did not know exactly when the slide would come. She only knew that it was coming, and that when it arrived she would have very little time. She lit every lantern in the tunnels and hung them at intervals along the timbers. She checked the food stores in each chamber, counting jars, counting sacks. She uncoiled the ropes and laid them out in careful loops beside the tunnel entrances. She opened the ventilation chimneys wider. She set out extra blankets. She placed her leather book of names, wrapped in oilcloth, into the deep pocket of her coat, because she had carried it every day for 50 years and she was not about to stop now. Then she sat down on a small wooden stool at the mouth of the church tunnel and she waited. The slide came at 3:47 in the morning. The number was not lost on her. She heard it before she felt it, a low grinding roar that seemed to come from every direction at once, and then the ground itself began to tremble, and the timbers around her creaked and settled and held. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Her lantern flames guttered and then steadied. From somewhere above and beyond, she heard the terrible muffled crash of buildings breaking apart. She heard, faintly, a scream that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then stopped. She heard the deep final settling thud of a mountain's worth of snow coming to rest on top of Hollow Pine. And then silence, the old silence, the silence she remembered. She sat still for a full 10 minutes, listening. She had learned at 9 years old that the mountain sometimes moved twice, and she was not going to be caught underestimating it now. When she was certain the slide had settled, she stood up, took her lantern in hand, and walked to the far end of the church tunnel. She placed her palm against the exit stone. She thought of her mother and of Elias Broward and of every name in her leather book. Then she pulled the iron lever, and the stone tipped inward, and she crawled through into the basement of St. Anselm's Chapel. The basement was dark. She lifted her lantern high and saw, in its yellow circle of light, exactly what she had prepared her whole life to see. 80 people were crammed into the stone room. Reverend Marsh stood at the far wall with one arm around his pregnant wife and the other around his daughter June. The Delacroix sisters sat together on a folding chair, holding hands. Hollis Wren had a small child in his lap, a little girl whose parents were not with her, and he was singing softly to her the way he sang to his crows. There were farmers and shopkeepers and schoolchildren and old women with their prayer books still clutched in their hands. They had come to the church because the church was the refuge, and now the refuge was buried, and every face in that room wore the expression of a person who understands they have been sealed inside their own tomb. Then they saw the lantern. For a long moment, no one moved. 80 faces turned toward the light. 80 pairs of eyes tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A small woman in a wool coat, standing beside an opening in the foundation wall that had not been there 10 minutes before, holding a kerosene lantern that threw her shadow long across the stone floor. Reverend Marsh took one slow step forward. "Dorothy," he said. His voice cracked on the second syllable. She set the lantern down on an overturned crate and pushed her shawl back from her shoulders. "Reverend," she said quietly, "we have work to do." What followed in the next several hours was the kind of quiet miracle that mountain villages sometimes tell stories about for 100 years afterward. Dorothy did not deliver a speech. She did not explain the tunnels. She simply began organizing the people in the basement the way a schoolteacher organizes a classroom, calmly and without argument. And one by one, the villagers found themselves following her instructions before they had fully understood what she was asking of them. She sent Holly's Wren and two younger men back through the tunnel to bring the first supplies. She sent the Delacroix sisters to inventory what food and water the church basement already contained. She asked Reverend Marsh to gather everyone able-bodied enough to work and to hold them ready. She sat with Clara Marsh, who was 7 months pregnant and shaking, and she pressed a warm blanket into her hands and told her, in a voice so gentle it made the young woman weep, that her baby was going to be born in the springtime, in a house with the windows open, and that she should try to sleep. By the time the first gray hint of dawn would have reached the ridge above Hollow Pine, though no one in the basement could see it, Dorothy's tunnel had delivered enough food to feed 80 people for 4 days, enough kerosene to burn every lamp in the church for a week, and enough wool blankets to cover every child and every elder in the room. Holly's Wren stood at the entrance of the tunnel with tears running openly down his weathered old face, because he had helped her dig the very first chamber 40 years earlier, and he had walked away shaking his head. And now, he understood what she had been building all that time, and he understood that he had been wrong about her every single day since. The village was buried in an average of 18 feet of packed avalanche debris. The pass to the lower valley was cut. The telephone lines were down. The nearest rescue crews, once word finally reached them from a logging camp 12 miles east that had seen the slide from a ridge, would need at least 4 days to break through with heavy equipment, and probably longer. Every roof in the village center had collapsed. Every home outside the church basement was crushed or sealed. There were people out there, families, children, elders, alive perhaps in pockets of air beneath their own broken beams the way Dorothy had once been alive beneath hers, and every hour that passed reduced their chances. On the second day, Dorothy took Reverend Marsh aside and spread a hand-drawn map on the basement floor. It showed every tunnel she had ever dug, every chamber, every gallery, every branching corridor beneath the village. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up at her. "Dorothy," he whispered, "how many of them can we reach?" She looked at the map. "Most of them," she said, "if we start now." They started that morning. Dorothy divided the able-bodied men and women in the basement into 3 teams, and she gave each team a section of the map and a lantern and a coil of rope and a bundle of the short-handled shovels she had stockpiled in the second chamber. She had planned for this, too. She had planned for all of it. The tunnels ran beneath every major lane in Hollow Pine, and from any point in the network, a determined digger could break upward through 8 or 10 feet of packed snow debris to reach the buried homes above. It was still terrible work. It was still slow, but it was possible, and possible was more than the village had possessed at 4 o'clock that morning. The first family they reached was the Halloran household on the East Lane. Peter Halloran, the freckled boy who had once whispered that Dorothy kept a human skull wrapped in newspaper, was now 15 years old, and he was pulled from beneath a splintered kitchen table 3 hours after the diggers broke through his back wall. His mother and younger sister came out behind him, both alive, both weeping. Peter did not weep. He walked straight through the tunnel to the church basement, found Dorothy where she was ladling soup for a row of shivering children, and stood in front of her without speaking. She looked up at him. She smiled very slightly. He said, "I'm sorry, Miss Ellsworth." She said, "Eat your soup, Peter." And that was the end of it. Over the next 6 days, the tunnels delivered 47 people back to the church basement. Some were unhurt. Some were carried on stretchers Holly's wren fashioned from broken pew boards and lengths of rope. 2 were dead when the diggers reached them. An elderly couple named Tomlin who had been asleep in their bed when the roof came down, and their bodies were laid gently in the coldest chamber of the tunnel network and covered with clean sheets until they could be brought up for burial. 3 bobbies were kept warm in the basement by rotating shifts of village women who took turns holding them against their own bodies. Clara Marsh went into false labor on the 5th day, and Dorothy sat with her through the night, holding her hand and telling her, over and over in the same gentle voice, about the way the light looks in April when it comes through a kitchen window and falls on a jar of preserves. On the 7th day, Reverend Marsh knelt beside Dorothy in the corner of the basement where she had finally allowed herself to sit down and rest. He asked her a question he had been carrying for days. "Dorothy," he said, why did you build all of this? Why did you spend 50 years digging in the dark?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the leather book of names, and she opened it and turned it toward him. He read the names. He did not recognize any of them. "These are the people who dug me out," she said, "in 1958. They came from other villages. They didn't know me. They came anyway." She closed the book gently. "I promised myself when I was 9 years old and lying in that hole in the snow that if I ever got the chance to pay them back, I would. Not to them, to someone, to anyone." She looked at him. "Reverend," she said, "tonight I have paid them back." On the 9th day, the diggers reached the last buried home. It stood at the far western edge of the village, a small timber-framed house that had been swept nearly 40 feet from its foundation by the leading edge of the slide, and then pinned against a stand of old cedars. The family inside was named Broward. They had moved to Hollow Pine only 3 years earlier from a place called Copper Fork, a fatting logging settlement in the lower valley where the mill had closed and the young families had scattered. There were 4 of them beneath the wreckage. A father named Daniel Broward, a mother named Sarah, and 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. They had survived by crawling into the iron bathtub in their washroom when they heard the slide coming, and the tub had held, though barely, beneath a collapsed section of roof. When the diggers broke through, and the first lantern light reached the little pocket where they had been huddled for 9 days, Daniel Broward looked up and saw a small woman in a wool coat crouched at the mouth of the tunnel. She reached in and took his daughter's hand first because the child was closest, and she pulled the little girl gently through the opening and into the shored gallery beyond. Then the boy, then the mother, then Daniel himself. He came out last, and he stood in the tunnel blinking in the lantern light, and he looked at the woman who had pulled his family from beneath the mountain, and he said, "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you." Dorothy studied his face for a long moment. She saw in the shape of his brow and the set of his jaw the face of a man she had last seen 50 years earlier in the office of a valley doctor, holding a shovel and looking down at a 41-pound child wrapped in a blanket. Elias Broward, the logger from Copper Fork. This man's grandfather, perhaps, or great-uncle. Someone of his blood in any case. Someone whose name was written in careful pencil in the leather book she carried in her pocket. She smiled. It was a small smile, and it was tired, and it was the smile of a woman who had just finished a very long piece of work. "You already did," she said quietly, "a long time ago." Then she turned and walked back down the gallery toward the church basement, and she did not explain, and Daniel Broward stood in the lantern light watching her go and wondered, for the rest of his life, what she had meant. The rescue crews from the lower valley finally broke through the pass on the 11th day. They found the village of Hollow Pine buried beneath 18 feet of debris, and they found 82 people alive in the basement of St. Anselm's Chapel. And they found, running beneath the ruined village like the roots of some enormous patient tree, a network of shored timber tunnels that no county map had ever recorded. The story of what Dorothy Ellsworth had done spread down through the valleys that spring, and then out beyond them, and eventually it reached places she had never been and people she had never met, the way certain stories always do. Dorothy herself said very little about it then or ever. She lived 19 more years in her small clapboard house at the western edge of the village. She kept digging, of course. Some habits, she said once, are simply the shape a life has taken. And every night before she slept, she still read one name aloud into the quiet room. Do you think Dorothy Ellsworth was truly extraordinary, or was she simply one of the few people willing to keep a promise made in the dark? Let us know in the comments.